The sky over Colony 7 had been the color of a bruise for 11 years. Marin Voss remembered blue. Not clearly, she'd been 4 when the quorum sealed the upper atmosphere, with its dispersal fields. The great gray curtains of particulate the architects had spread to cool a world they decided was running too hot. She remembered blue the way you remember a word in a language you no longer speak. A shape with no sound attached to it. She held that memory the way some people hold a stone worn smooth by a river. Not because it was useful, but because it had been touched by something real. She worked in the Museum of Continuance on the 2nd level of the Colony Dome, performing what the quorum called living demonstrations. 3 times a day, Marin and her partner Davin and 2 other demonstrators would step into the glass-walled diorama and act out scenes from human domestic life. The kind the architects found educational, meaning the kind that explained why humans had nearly destroyed themselves before the intervention. They set a table, they argued over a meal. They moved through the gestures of a life that no longer existed, and the architects watched from the viewing gallery, with their long amber eyes and their slight forward lean of fascination. The way a child watches an insect in a jar. Davin called it the exhibit. He called it this the way a man calls his own living, without looking at it directly. On the morning that changed everything, Marin was arranging dried polymer flowers in a glass vase. A prop, part of the domestic scene, meant to represent the old human custom of bringing living plants indoors. When she looked up through the glass and saw one of the architect observers watching her with an expression she had learned, over 5 years of this work, to identify as something close to pity. The architect was tall, as they all were, with the plated secondary shoulders that indicated administrative rank. It tilted its head at her. Then it moved on. She set down the flowers. In the diorama's back corner, hidden behind the prop kitchen cabinet, the Davin had scratched something into the polymer board with a piece of scrap metal he'd kept for 3 months. He'd shown it to her 6 weeks ago, pressing her hand against the letters so she could feel the shape of them in the dark. They took something from us. They cannot name. She'd told him to scratch it out. He hadn't. The thing about the architects, and Marin had thought about this more than was safe, was that they were not cruel in any way that satisfied. They did not enjoy suffering. They were not theatrical about their control. They had surveyed the human species and produced, with the kind of clean precision that made you understand exactly why they'd won the war. That wasn't a war, a management protocol that addressed what they called the biological pressure problem. Humans reproduced at rates the architects' models deemed catastrophically unsustainable for a species under transitional custodianship. The solution was, by their own description, temporary, a generation moratorium, 40 years of 0 human births, while the quorum restructured the colony's resource allocation, and the survivors stabilized into what the architects' documents called a viable generational remnant. They issued couples biomechanical companion units instead. The units were remarkable, genuinely remarkable, in the cold way that made Marin's stomach turn. They moved. They made sounds calibrated to activate the same neurological pathways as infant vocalizations. The architects had studied human brain chemistry long enough to produce something that registered, at a deep and wordless level, as almost right. Almost. The gap between almost and right was the size of a universe, but the architects did not seem to understand this. Or perhaps they did understand it, and had decided it was an acceptable remainder. Marin and Davin had been issued Unit 7 Ta 4 years ago. Davin had put it in the storage room after 3 weeks and never spoken about it again. Marin had gone in there, once in the middle of the 3rd night, and found herself kneeling on the floor with her hand on the unit's chest, feeling the soft hum of its regulator, and she'd thought, this is what they think we are. This is the shape of us to them. Something that can be satisfied with the right inputs. She'd stood up and gone back to bed and told Davon the next morning that she was pregnant. He went stills in the way that large men go still when they are afraid. Not frozen, but quieted. All the energy compressed inward. Everything careful. Then he said, how long have you known? 3 days. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. Then he said, we'll need to go below. Below meant the civil infrastructure level. The old service corridors that predated the architect reconfiguration of the colony. They ran under the dome's foundation in long dark channels that smelled of mineral water and old metal. Devan had found them 2 years ago while working a maintenance rotation, had said nothing to anyone, had spent his spare hours quietly mapping the accessible sections. He'd done this the way he did most things, without explaining why until the reason became obvious. You already knew, Marin said. I thought we might need somewhere. You planned this. He looked at her then, and his expression was something she didn't have a word for. Not quite love, not quite grief. Something that held both of them in a space beyond what those words could reach. I planned for you, he said. I didn't know about the rest. The rest. She put her hand flat on her own stomach, over the small fact of it, and felt something she recognized from an old book she'd read in the museum archives when she was supposed to be cataloging demonstration props. The book was a personal record from before the intervention, a journal kept by a woman she'd never know, and in it was a line she'd read so many times she'd committed it against her own will. I did not decide to love it. I simply found that I already did. They moved her below in the 4th month, when the colony's health monitoring systems would begin to flag anomalous mass readings if she remained in their registered quarters. Davin told the neighbor registry that Maren was undergoing voluntary cognitive realignment therapy, a program the Quorum offered to citizens showing signs of what was officially called biological nostalgia disorder. It was a plausible excuse. Half the women in their sector had gone through it. The corridor was cold. Maren made it livable with the patience of someone who has decided. She had the light strips Davan brought, the thermal blanket, the archive reader loaded with the things she wanted the child to know someday. Music, stories, the names of the animals that no longer existed, the way a forest had sounded in the rain. She read aloud sometimes, not to the child yet, just to practice. It felt important to practice. Devon came every day, always at irregular intervals, always through a different access point. He brought food, the compressed ration packs, but also, when he could manage it, small real things, a scrap of dried root vegetable from the agricultural sector. Once, a single orange segment in a folded piece of cloth, and she'd held it to her face and breathed it before eating it and thought, this is the smell of the world that existed before. Their neighbors were Sarah and Holt Maddox. Maren had never liked Sarah, had always found in her a quality of desperate brightness, the kind of person who smiled with too much effort, whose gestures said I am trying to be happy because there is no other option. Holt was quiet in a way that didn't mean contentment. They had Unit 8 Omicron, their companion unit, which Maren had seen Sarah carrying once in the corridor with a tenderness so sincere it had made her look away. Devon ran into Sarah at the water distribution point in the 7th month. He told Maren about it that evening, sitting on the floor of the corridor with his back against the wall, turning his empty water container over in his hands. She asked about you, where you were. I said the realignment program. She believed you? He was quiet. Devon, I don't know what she believes, he said. She looked at me in a way I didn't like. Maren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, lock the upper access hatch from now on. It's already locked. Lock it better. The birth happened in the 8th month, 3 weeks early. There were no architect medical systems, no colony doctors, no one who could be present without knowing. There was only Davin, who had spent 5 months quietly accessing medical archive files at the museum terminal during lunch rotations, reading delivery procedures with the calm and thoroughness of a man who understood that there was no alternative to knowing. He had asked the archive's tutorial system questions under a borrowed access code, patient and methodical, the way he did everything that mattered. Maren did not scream. This was not courage, it was architecture. The corridors carried sound upward through the ventilation channels, and sound meant discovery. She pressed her face into Davin's shoulder and made no sound and felt, at the center of that terrible silence, something she would spend years trying to describe and never quite manage. The world reorganizing itself around a new fact. The child was small. She was small and she was real. And she was warm in a way the unit had never been. Not the warmth of a regulated temperature, but the warmth of a body generating its own heat against the cold. Fighting already without knowing what fighting was. Davin held her first because Maren's hands were shaking. He held her with the focused gentleness of a man handling something irreplaceable, which was exactly what she was. And Maren watched his face and saw the thing that the architects, for all their study of human neurological pathways, had not been able to replicate in polymer and microcircuit. The look of a person discovering they love something more than they love their own survival. We need a name, Maren said. I've been thinking about Bray, he said. It had been his mother's name. His mother had died in the colony resettlement 12 years ago. Maren said yes. For 6 weeks they existed in a suspension of terror and joy, the two things wound together so tightly she couldn't separate them. She slept in intervals. Davin managed the cover story with the quietness of someone who has simply decided that this is the task, and it must be done well. The child, Bray, was 3 weeks old when she first laughed, which was not a laugh yet but the physical precursor to one, the surprised open mouth, the body's first practice at delight, and Marin thought, there it is. There is the thing they cannot build. Sarah Maddox found them in the 5th week. Marin heard the upper hatch first. A sound that was wrong, too light, too irregular for Devon's pattern, and had just enough time to put the child against her chest and move to the far corridor before Sarah came down the access ladder with a handlight and found the space. She stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked at the thermal blanket, the light strips, the archive reader. She looked at Marin, she looked at the child. Her face did something complicated. Marin had expected fear or the careful no exploitation of someone calculating their next move. Instead, Sarah looked the way someone looks when they've been hungry for a very long time and someone puts food in front of them, and they can't quite believe it's allowed. She's real, Sarah said. Sarah's actually real. She took a step forward. Can I hold her? Marin shifted the child closer. Don't. Sarah stopped. The hand light trembled slightly. I won't tell, she said. I promise I won't tell. I want to be near her, that's all. I just want to be near something real. Her voice had a quality in it that Marin recognized from the journal, from all the old records she'd spent years reading in the museum archives. The voice of someone who has been trying not to want something and has failed and doesn't care anymore about the failure. Let me help, please. I can cover for you. I have access to the sector distribution logs. I can adjust the consumption records so the extra resource draw doesn't flag. I can help. Marin looked at her for a long time. All right, she said, but you don't tell Holt. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Holt found out 3 days later. This was the part that Marin would replay for years afterward, the part she'd go over in the dark and ask herself what she could have changed. Holt came down the ladder in the second night and stood at the bottom, looking at the child in Marin's arms, with an expression that was not Sarah's hunger. It was something else. It was want that had soured the particular quality of a person who has decided that if they cannot have the thing should at least be partly theirs. He said very carefully that this needed to be a shared arrangement. That there was no reason, he said, for Marin and Davin to be the only ones. That if they were going to take this risk together, then the child should belong to all of them together. He said it the way a person says something they've rehearsed, until it sounds reasonable. Davin came down the ladder 20 minutes later and stood behind Marin and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, that's not an arrangement. That's a claim. Holt's expression changed. Then I'm making a claim. You're going to leave this corridor, Davin said. His voice was very quiet. It was the voice of a man who is not threatening anything because he doesn't need to. And then we're going to figure out how to move her somewhere you don't know about. Holt left. They knew, both of them, that they had days at most. The Quorum's enforcement system operated through what the architects called civic accountability protocols, which in practice meant that any registered colony member who reported a violation received a resource allocation bonus, and that within 20 minutes of a verified report, 2 architect compliance officers would arrive at the registered location of the violation, lower a containment dome over the transgressors, and leave them there for 12 hours, before the dome's atmospheric regulators shifted the internal gas mixture to end them. It was not dramatic. The domes were opaque from the outside. No one saw. Davin had been thinking about the domes for 3 years. He'd spent 3 years doing something the architects would not have categorized as a threat, because it did not look like anything. It looked like curiosity. Over 3 years of maintenance rotations, library access, quiet conversations with the colony's structural engineering archivist, he had built a complete map of the old civil defense infrastructure, not the reconfigured architect systems, but the original human-built substrata, the layer of colony that predated the intervention. The corridors Marin had lived in for 4 months were part of it, but they were not all of it. Under the colony's Sector 6 junction, under a specific intersection of pedestrian paths that Devon had measured, from above, against the underground map he'd memorized, there was an access shaft that connected to a navigable waterway, a pre-intervention drainage channel wide enough for a small watercraft that ran 3 kilometers southeast and emerged in the uninhabited industrial buffer zone near the colony's outer perimeter. Davin had put a folded inflatable raft down that shaft 14 months ago. He had not told Marin about this until the night after Holt's visit, sitting in the dark of the lower corridor, with the child sleeping between them, when he finally spread the map out on the floor and showed her everything. She looked at the map for a long time. She looked at his face. You planned this, she said again. I planned for you, he said again. The same words, the same weight in them. She folded the map along its original creases. We move tomorrow. They moved at 0300, when the colony's external monitoring cycle had its lowest overlap between sensor sweeps. Another thing Devan had spent 3 years quietly learning. Marin carried the child in a thermal wrap against her chest. She carried the archive reader with the music and the stories and the animal names. She did not carry the polymer flowers. They were 40 meters from the Sector 6 junction when they heard the compliance officers. Not a sound. The architects didn't make much sound when they moved. But the quality of the light changed. The environmental panels in this part of the colony shifted to a slightly higher register when compliance officers were operating nearby. Something in the frequency of their communication arrays that the human-built light systems responded to without anyone having designed them to. Davan had noticed this 2 years ago. He'd written it down. He took Marin's arm and they stopped. Down the corridor ahead of them, moving at the measured pace of absolute confidence, were 2 architect compliance officers. They were tall, the administrative plate shoulders catching the ambient light. They moved without urgency, which was its own kind of terrible, the pace of something that has never had to hurry, because nothing has ever been fast enough to require it. They had not seen Marin and Davan yet. The corridor bent. There were 6 seconds, at the officer's current pace, before the bend would bring them into sightline. Devan stepped in front of Marin, putting his body between her and the corner. He reached back without looking and pressed his hand flat against her sternum, against the child, and held it there. She understood. Don't move, don't breathe, wait. Then he walked around the corner. She heard him before she could see anything. His voice steady and ordinary, the way a person sounds when they have decided to be a door between something they love and something that would end it. Officers, I've been trying to find the compliance station. My registration code is flagging an anomaly, and I can't get the terminal to clear it. There was a pause. The architects communicated with humans in a translated register that was technically fluent and emotionally wrong, in a way that took years to stop noticing. Identification. Davan Voss Sector 4 Museum Demonstration Staff, Code Voss 477 Tau. Another pause. Marin heard the soft click of a verification device. Your residential unit shows an absence flag. My partner is in realignment therapy. I've been sleeping at the museum. I know it's irregular. The silence from the compliance officers had a particular texture. The architects were not suspicious in the human sense. They did not tell stories about what might be happening. They processed information against probability matrices and either flagged or did not flag. Davan's code was clean. His explanation was coherent. His physiological outputs, they would be reading him, Marin knew, heat signature and cortisol analog microtremor analysis, were those of an ordinary man with a minor administrative problem. Davan had never been afraid in a way that showed. This was not a talent, it was a practice. He had spent 3 years practicing it. The anomaly will self-resolve in 48 hours, the officer said. There is no action required. Thank you, Davan said. I appreciate the clarification. She heard the officers move on. She heard Davan's footsteps come back around the corner. Unhurried, he appeared in the corridor. His expression was entirely calm. Only his hands, when he reached for her, were shaking. Go, he said quietly. The Sector 6 junction was exactly where the map said it would be. The shaft was narrow and smelled of mineral water and decades. Marin went down first. The child pressed against her, and reached the bottom and stood in the dark and felt the cold air moving from the southeast, and thought about the woman in the journal, and the line she'd read so many times. I simply found that I already did. Davine came down behind her. He pulled the raft from the alcove where he'd stored it, unfolded it against the wall, opened the compressed inflation valve with a soft hiss of gas. The sound seemed enormous in the narrow space. They both froze. Nothing happened. The sound moved down the tunnel and was absorbed by distance. The raft was small, barely large enough for 2 adults and an infant. It was old. The polymer had yellowed at the seams. Davan tested the seal with his hand and nodded. It'll hold, he said. You've never actually done this part, Marin said. No, but you've thought about it. Extensively, she almost laughed. In the dark, in the tunnel, with the compliance officers somewhere above them and the quorum's entire management apparatus spread across the sky, she almost laughed. The child stirred against her chest, made a small sound, not distress, just the utterance of a creature adjusting to the world, and Marin put her lips against the top of her head and breathed in. They pushed off from the tunnel wall, and the current took them. It was not fast. The pre-intervention drainage channel moved with the patient gravity of water that had been moving in the same direction for generations, unhurried, indifferent to the urgency of the people it was carrying. Marin sat in the raft with the child in her lap and watched the tunnel walls pass in the narrow beam of the handlight and felt, for the first time in months, something she hadn't expected. Stillness. Not safety. She wasn't foolish enough to confuse them. But underneath the fear, underneath the cold, and the smell of mineral water, and the soft sounds of the raft against the current, there was a quality of stillness that had the feeling of something reclaimed. Devon sat across from her and watched the way ahead. His face in the handlight was the face of a man fully occupied with what he was doing, which Marin had always loved about him. The way he was never somewhere else when something needed him. He had always been entire present to whatever was real. "What do you think it'll be like?" she said. "Outside. Cold. The industrial buffer zone isn't heated. I mean further." He was quiet for a moment. "The architect's dispersal fields don't extend beyond the outer perimeter. The smog is thinner east of the buffer zone. There's soil. Not great soil, but soil." He paused. "I looked it up." "Of course you did. There are colonist groups in the outer territories. 3 that I found records of. People who left before the monitoring protocols tightened." Marin looked down at the child. Bray was awake, looking up at the tunnel's ceiling, with the uncomplicated attention of a creature that has not yet learned to be afraid of darkness, that accepts each new thing the world offers as simply the next thing. "She's going to want to know where she came from," Marin said. "Then we'll tell her." "All of it?" "All of it," Davin said. "The museum, the dioramas, the way the exhibit ran 3 times a day." He paused. "The flowers." She thought about the polymer flowers in the glass vase. She thought about the architect observer tilting its head, its long amber eyes finding something in her that approximated what they were looking for, and never quite landing on the real thing. She thought about how long the architects had studied human beings and how much they understood, and what specifically they had missed. They had missed this. They had missed the fact that humans would build a map and store a raft, and learn obstetrics from stolen archive files, and practice being unafraid until it became a kind of skill. They had missed the fact that humans would eat a single orange segment and save the smell of it somewhere that no protocol could reach. They had missed the fact that you could perform a domestic scene in a glass box 3 times a day for 5 years and still know, in the part of you that the compliance officer's heat signatures couldn't read and the probability matrices couldn't process, that you were more than the performance. The architects were not wrong about humans. They had simply made the mistake of believing that the distance between what humans were and what humans should be, as the architects defined it, was a gap that could be managed, filled with adequate alternatives, regulated toward acceptable. They had not understood that the gap was not a problem. The gap was the place where the actual thing lived. The tunnel end came as a widening of air and a change in the darkness. Not light exactly, but the absence of confinement, the subtle pressure change of an open space ahead. Davin reached out and killed the handlight. They drifted the last 50 meters in blackness, and then the raft bumped gently against a concrete ledge and stopped. Above them was an access grate. Through it, the industrial buffer zone, dark and cold, the air tasting of metal and distance, and something underneath both of those things that Marin had not smelled in so long she didn't immediately recognize it. She breathed it again. Soil. Damp soil and old plant matter, the deep organic smell of earth that hasn't been processed or optimized or managed by anything other than time. Davin lifted the grate. It moved without resistance. He climbed up first, checked the open ground in every direction, then reached back for her. She handed him the child and climbed out. The sky above the buffer zone was not blue. It was the same bruised gray she'd grown up under, the same dispersal field murk. But on the eastern horizon, where the architect fields were thinner, there was something. Not blue, not yet. A lightness. A place where the gray thinned toward something it had not yet decided to be. She stood on the soil of the outer world, and held her daughter, and looked at that horizon, and thought about the woman in the journal, and all the words she'd read by handlight in the corridor. And the way some words stay in you, not because you put them there, but because they find a place that was already their shape. Behind her, Davin was folding the raft. This was the kind of person he was. They'd just escaped an alien compliance system, through a pre-intervention drainage tunnel on a homemade inflatable boat, while carrying an illegal infant. And he was folding the raft because you didn't leave things behind if you could take them. Because you didn't waste what had worked. Because the habits of a careful person don't stop at the edge of the crisis. She loved him so much it had the quality of an ache. "East," she said. "East," he said. He tucked the raft under his arm. "I know a route." "Of course you do." The child made a sound. Not distress. Not the unit's calibrated approximation of an infant utterance, designed to activate the correct neurological pathways. Just a sound a small human makes at the edge of a cold morning, taking an errand world, and whatever comes next. Entirely uninterested in whether it was permitted, they walked east. The quorum's dispersal fields thinned slowly, the way the end of anything long-sustained does. Not a sudden lifting but a gradual dilution. The gray becoming gray-white, becoming something that didn't have a name in the color vocabulary of Colony 7. Marin watched it as she walked. She watched the horizon do its slow work of deciding what color it was going to be. It took 3 hours. By the time the sun, the actual sun, which she had not seen clearly since she was 4 years old, broke through the upper atmosphere and cast its light in a straight, unfiltered line across the outer territories. She had forgotten what to expect from it. It was not the bruised light of the dome. It was not the calibrated illumination of the museum panels. It was light that didn't care about atmospheric management or resource allocation, or the biological pressure problem, or what a viable generational remnant required. It was just light, doing what light does, which is fall on everything equally and without permission. Bray saw it first. She turned her small face toward the source, with the immediate instinctive attention of a creature that had never seen it before, and somehow already knew what it was. And her expression was the thing. The open-mouthed, total, uncomplicated expression of something encountering pure fact for the first time. Marin stopped walking. She just stood there in the outer territories, with her daughter facing the sun, and her partner folding an old raft at her back, and she felt the thing she'd been trying to name for 8 months and could not. It was not safety, it was not victory, it was not even happiness exactly, though it held happiness inside it. It was the feeling of being entirely present to something real. Behind them, the colony dome sat gray and sealed on the horizon. The quorum's dispersal field spread across the sky like a hand held flat above a fire. The architects were inside it, moving through their compliance protocols, updating their probability matrices, issuing companion units and resource bonuses and realignment therapy programs to a population they had studied comprehensively and understood incompletely. They would update their models eventually. They would add this variable, this improbable, irrational, metabolically inefficient behavior, the cave birth, the folded raft, the 3 years of quiet preparation, to their data. They would try to build a protocol for it. They would not succeed. Not because humans were stronger or smarter or built for this kind of survival, but because the thing the architects couldn't model was not a tactic. It wasn't a survival strategy or an expression of biological imperative. It was the plain fact of a person who loved something and would not be managed out of it, standing in a field on a cold morning, watching her daughter's face when light, real light, found it for the first time. You couldn't build a dome around that. You couldn't regulate it toward acceptable. You could only watch it, with your long amber eyes and your administrative plate shoulders, and understand at last that you had measured everything and missed the only thing that mattered. Davin appeared at her shoulder. He looked at Bray's face. He looked at the horizon. "There's a settlement," he said, "about 9 kilometers northeast. The records I found were 18 months old, but you think they're still there. I think people who go to the trouble of building something outside the dome don't tend to give it up easily." Marin shifted the child against her chest. Bray was still looking at the sun with that open, accepting face, storing up the world, filing it away in the wordless archive of a new person deciding what the world is. "Tell me about the settlement," Mara said. Devon started walking. He talked as he walked. The records he'd found, the energy signatures, the agricultural activity logged at the edge of the buffer zone's old sensor range, before those sensors had gone unmaintained. He talked the way he always did when he was telling her something he'd been carrying alone for a while, straightforwardly, without drama, as though the information were simply waiting to be given, and now it was time. She listened. She walked. The light came down on all of it. Behind them, Colony 7 sat under its bruise-colored sky, waiting for someone to come home. Ahead of them, 9 kilometers northeast, people who had made the same impossible choice were doing what humans have always done in the spaces where management ends and life begins. Making something that wasn't there before, and refusing, with every quiet, stubborn, animal breath, to stop.